Afternoon, everybody. My name is Don DeRay with Concensus Technologies, and welcome to the What's New in Identity Manager 4.8 webinar. Just want to make sure that everybody can hear, so if you could raise your hands if you're hearing me clearly, or put a note in the chat if you are having problems hearing me. Okay, I'm getting good thumbs up, so I'm going to go ahead and continue on then. So what's new in Identity Manager today, we're going to talk about the release that just came out about 2 weeks ago. We're going to talk about the installation options that are out there, and there's a couple different ways you can do that through typical install, their new container feature, which we're going to be talking a lot about, and cloud options that are out there for the product. We're also going to talk a little bit about the new features that are out there. We're going to start with basically the eDirectory, move on to the engine and any changes in the engine, talk a little bit about some of the changes in Designer that are out there, and finally the identity applications. And we're going to see that the identity applications is where they put in most of the effort in this release, making some changes there, moving things forward on the advanced edition of the product. I do realize that a lot of our customers are not using the advanced edition, but that's where most of the changes needed to be made in terms of usability, upgradability, and things like that. And finally, obviously, we're going to talk about how you need to upgrade to IDM 4.8 and some of the things you need to take a look at as you're planning on doing your upgrade to Identity Manager 4.8. So let's just jump right in and talk about the installation options. The installation options are, first, we're going to talk about enterprise mode. That's the mode that you know the most, the download, the executable to install locally on premise. One of the nice things that I've taken a screenshot of the download site is that they have full product installs now for Linux and Windows, which include all the identity products and everything else that you need, SSPR, etc. But they've also now come up with a remote loader only ISO. And why that's really important, why I put an exclamation point there, is there's one of my big pet peeves a long time ago was we were running, a lot of our customers are running the Vault on SUSE Linux. We're downloading the Linux version, but then we have to go download the complete Windows version, which is over 4 gigs, to be able to install the remote loader on a Windows server if there's an Active Directory environment there. So just to be able to install that, just to be able to install the remote loader and the drivers, you can see those are really small downloads. So those are really nice options that they finally did there. And of course, they have Designer only downloads and the Analyzer downloads, which is nice because we now have in Designer, we have a Mac, a Linux, and a Windows version as well. So we don't have to download a full product DVD anymore and keep those laying around to do that. And as you can see, the Linux version's checking in at 2 gigs, while the Windows version is at 3.5. So they have cut down on the size on these things somewhat, but there are still plenty of downloads to choose from. So let's continue on. That your typical install. I'm not going to talk a lot about your typical install, which is the exe install. You still have to do the installation of the product, and then you have to do the configuration as the next step. That really has not changed in that process. I just want to mention that. Installation options. This is the container option. With IDM 4.8, it actually started with eDirectory 9.2. They began containerizing everything. The reason we have containers these days is that the industry is moving, and when I say the industry, I mean Gartner is telling all the identity and access management folks, and they did this at their December conference last year, that they need to start making installation and upgrade easier and start to follow more of a DevOps model, instead of the monolithic, build out the servers, build out the virtual machines, and start doing that, but move more towards a DevOps model, which lets them be more flexible and certainly makes the upgrade a lot easier. So it is possible to run on any OS that supports Docker. We've actually been able to install part of the products on, they all are supported on it, but any Docker host, which includes Ubuntu. So it's pretty interesting to see iManager and Identity Manager running on a Ubuntu box. I never thought that would happen, an open source box like that we would be able to run Identity Manager on, but it's actually, if you get used to the command line, unless you're going to be running Kubernetes or something like Rancher, I'm going to talk about that in a second here, it's pretty easy to deploy the product and get into it. It is certainly a new mindset, and if you're just getting into it, you don't have an infrastructure for managing your containers. If you don't have a strategy for managing containers, this might not be the option for you. It is really different than managing it through any thing that we're used to as far as virtual machines go. So if you don't have Kubernetes or Rancher, and there's Salt and CDF are mentioned here, but all the documentation points to using Kubernetes or Rancher. So if you're going to be making an investment into that, you might want to take a look at Kubernetes and Rancher for managing those. SUSE has a product, Containers as a Service, that we're looking at pretty hard. Also, Concensus will be having this option in 2020. We're actually working with VMware right now in our cloud environment to get things upgraded in there to be able to support some of the container stuff that they're bringing to the mix with their Pivotal purchase and some of the things they announced at VMware World. So we'll be able to do the containers and spin up dev environments and things like that, host production, and be able to utilize the ability to bring down a container and bring up a new container, and you're upgraded. And then obviously with the ability to roll back pretty easily with those containers. On the right side of the screen there, you'll see the actual containers that are listed in the documentation that are available. And we've actually done the iManager and the Vault. We've set those up in our labs. SSPR has kind of been a container even since they came out with the appliance. That was kind of the first go at creating a container, but that one's built into the appliance if you're running the SSPR appliance. But these containers, there's no guest OS, that you have to bring your own container. But it is, like I said, really nice to see running on different platforms, seeing these products run on those platforms without too much difficulty. Networking and things like that, if you're not familiar with containers, are a challenge. You have to get your head wrapped around it. A lot of it is command line at this point. That's why we've been talking to VMware. One of their goals is to make it as easy to deploy a virtual machine as it will be to deploy a container in their environment. Okay, cloud options. This kind of started with the last versions of eDirectory and even IDM, that they were actually supported on the public cloud on Azure and AWS. And if you look at the documentation, you'll see, some steps to actually deploy virtual machines with a VPN out in the cloud. And a note that I mentioned in here that they do not support, the AWS or Azure catalog. So you can't just go and say, hey, I want to spin up a Vault server. We have to actually build out the virtual machine on Linux or Windows and then install the product on there. The last bullet there, future releases will include IAM as a service and hybrid with AWS and Azure catalog installs. That is on the roadmap for them to be able to provide these as a container service out there within, and it'll be transparent to you because it'll be in the catalog. It'll just deploy for you if you need a Vault, if you need a iManager instance or what have you. But Concensus, again, we are currently managing customers' Vaults, Access Manager, Advanced Authentication, products like that, and we will have those container options coming again first quarter of 2020. Just to talk a little bit about eDirectory 9.2, this actually released a couple weeks before Identity Manager. Again, number one, container option. It's still available. But the biggest thing, then, we're very, very happy to see this, is that the REST API, the endpoints, are going to be available. I talked to the product manager. They were waiting for some certifications to come through as they release things worldwide. So they will be actually shipping. I've actually seen the product, seen it in the beta. That we're going to be able to expose that, and I've got some screenshots that I'll talk about in the next slide. One of the other new things that they added to eDirectory is support for non-reversible password storage. I wanted to mention this here, but that's not something that we're going to be able to do with Identity Manager for synchronizing passwords. We cannot have the password in a non-reversible hash if we're going to synchronize passwords to our other systems. So right now, everything's stored encrypted, but Identity Manager in the universal password, Identity Manager able to unencrypt that to be able to synchronize that password change or that password to our downstream systems. It's just the way that works. Non-reversible password storage is a great thing for security, but it's not going to allow the identity manager to obviously synchronize that to anywhere else, unless it would be to another like eDirectory tree. Okay. Support for SLES 15 SP1 and Red Hat, and Windows 2019 is in here. Support for SLES 11 and Red Hat 6 has actually been deprecated, as well as Server 2012. So if we have some older servers that we have out there, we're going to have to do a migration and not do an in-place upgrade to get us up to the latest version. We're still heavily supporting any version of SLES, and we're also, happy with Windows Server 2016. We actually have not installed it on 2019 yet, but it is obviously supported. I also wanted to mention that XDAS was deprecated in this release. So they had mentioned that in the last release, that would be the last one that supported that, because they came out with CEF for auditing in the last one. And I also put a note in here that the README mentions that the audit platform agent will be deprecated in 9.3. I don't think we have any customers running that, the old Novell audit platform, but I just wanted to mention when eDirectory 9.3 comes out that it will be deprecated as well. So let's take a look at the REST API endpoints. Really, that we're doing support for CRUD operations, and the chart down in the bottom right of this actually shows LDAP to REST, how those methods are going to work. And they've actually done a really good job. If you go out and look at the documentation, you can actually go see all the methods, and they'll have examples and things like that. It's just like any REST endpoint. It's very well documented. And that's kind of why they went from, they're trying to move everybody off of using LDAP over into REST. Most of our developers today are very familiar using REST endpoints, and everybody's moved to kind of using JSON and REST as kind of the de facto standard when you were talking about building and querying and doing things like that on applications. So Novell's just kind of following suit here. But the APIs that we're going to have here are going to also include multi-factor authentication using advanced auth, using OSP, which you'll see in the top right here, kind of how this will work. You'll have your eDirectory servers, and then you'll have a REST server, so to speak, replica, but you also have this OSP server that's going to be out there that's going to facilitate the single sign-on and login. So they're actually delivered as two containers, so you can have them probably on the same box. We're still waiting to see this, because we're going to be testing this out and actually taking a look at building our own applications on top of eDirectory now, because of these endpoints. One of the things that was supposed to be in this release that they did not, that they pulled out of the release, was a new replacement for iManager, that we're going to have a new console, management console, and it's going to be based on REST endpoints that are in there. While the back end, I do believe, is complete here, the roadmap had, at the same time, had the release for the beta version of the new management console. We hope to see that by the end of the year. And no, I do not have any screenshots of that. The ones that I have are very early, and I won't be able to show that because it's I'm only allowed on this public forum to release things that are basically in the public domain. So anything in the documentation, etc. So that's why we're not showing a lot of pictures and things like that in here. So let's move on to the Identity Manager 4.agent. I do have an error in here. It requires eDirectory 9.2 and not 4.8. But it can be deployed as a container, and I did, for your amusement, show you what it actually takes to deploy this is actually eDirectory, because you can see that it's actually saying it should be the engine, but it's the same install process for, you just have to point to the correct image, Docker image, to be able to do this. But you can see it's actually kind of complicated. The Docker run, give it the IP address, the network name, the host name, the path that's going to be where it's actually going to store the data. There's actual this one's actually storing it in the Docker slash root slash Docker slash engine. And what's nice about that is that's would be locally on that machine. But if you had a clustering environment, you were going to share these things, you would have to mount the shared volume on the Linux box to be able to put that out there. So, that comes to your container strategy and how high availability you're going to make it. You have to open the ports, some of these other things here, all the ports that you actually have to open, and you can actually point it to the configuration file if you want to configure it on the fly here. But that is just a sample of one of the 5 or 6, and there was, how many containers? I think 7 or 8. You'd have to run that to be able to get those all to install. So there is no overall, let's deploy a container strategy, and the installation is very command line driven at this point. But when talking about the engine, they have a simplified install on the Windows platform. It's gotten a lot better over the last 2 releases. That wizard is out there for installing a custom install or an unattended mode. Mostly that's for the advanced edition. The standard edition, there is no separate eDirectory IDM engine install. It's one install now. So that's there's not much going on in the engine in this release. As I mentioned here, there's no big changes to the engine. It's still the same good core engine that we've been using for the last 4 or 5 releases. But it's been pretty stable and very, very, very good for a very long time. So they didn't need to mess with that a whole bunch. So let's go over to Designer updates. Designer now has support for Git. And I actually grabbed this directly from the documentation. You can use Git to share packages when the packages are developed or staged. NetIQ does not recommend you use Git for Designer for project versioning. So I know, know some folks on the webinar that are using SVN right now, and that's where we're going to still do our development and things like that. But when you want to develop stuff and you want to stage it and then promote it and things like that, Git might be something we take a look at implementing. We use Git here internally for all our things, so we're going to have, Mike's going to be taking a look at how we're going to fit Git into our even our release schedule and things like that, because we actually do store everything in Git right now in Bitbucket for our releases. That will work with the packages. Now this obviously is just for the packages, not necessarily the binaries, but we will be, and it's interesting, they say bit package for version support for Git for package for version control, but then they say right in the documentation. So they threw this in here and they've made the changes, and I'll show you a couple screenshots on the next slide, what you can do with it. So we're going to have to be taking a look at that pretty hard. New actions that are in here, most of them are around the advanced edition: delete resource, delete role, if operation entitlement, modify resource, modify role. Those are some things that can be invoked now as an action. The last one, remove named password, set named password. Those are global variables that are out there that actually can be set now in policy. But we can also, and I left that for last, was invoke a REST endpoint. What would be very interesting about that is a driver could actually invoke, as part of their action, any REST endpoint that you could call. So, there are settings in there for, I think, basic and OAuth type authentication. So it's very possible that you could be using the Google driver and actually make a REST call out to Microsoft's Graph API for some good reason if you wanted to. There's all kinds of things that you could do with being able to invoke a REST point from an action, which is pretty cool. Also, the last one here, support for creating forms using the new workflow form builder, and I'll show that right as we get to the identity applications. Next, we have using Git and Designer. These are just some screenshots from Designer that'll actually show you how you can actually create a new Git repository here, and you can see that that's actually part of the package catalog in here, and you can add an existing Git repository. You can clone one, create a local. So if you were going to share, let's say you used it for yourself and you wanted to share that with Concensus, we could actually clone that, work on that kind of deal, and as a way of sharing with somebody else. Again, we're going to have to wait and see how it flushes out, how it starts to work with our customer environments. So the new forms is built on forms.io, and I have a little little bit of a slide a little bit later on, but I wanted to show you what some of those form components look like right now. It's actually accessible from Designer, so you would go into your workflow forms, and as you create a new one, the form builder will come up within Designer. Now, this is also, as it's a separate install, it's on its own type server. It's a Form.io server or a container. It's actually just being kind of plugged in. It can actually be accessed from a website too, but they put it right inside of Designers as a, you have to put the URL in basically to be able to get to it. But you'll be able to go into the form builder, create and drag and drop. Here's the basic components that are available here, and then the advanced one, and a dynamic entity or dynamic query. Here's a dynamic query when you open that up. So if you, for instance, needed to list some groups that you needed to put in here for people to select, you could actually go out and write this query, go to this DN, give me all the groups or things like that, so that you can make them selectable for use in your form. So there's a lot more power and a lot more ease of use within this form, generating forms now with this switch over to forms.io. So let's talk a little bit about identity applications. The new form builder, form.io, you can look it up on the internet. They have an open source version of it for you to take a look at. But the forms are stored now in JSON format and integrated with Designer. Your existing forms that you have, and again, this is advanced edition stuff, existing forms must be recreated. They cannot be migrated. There is no tool to do that. So obviously, the older ones are still supported, but you can go back and recreate them and reassign them and start using the new forms, but they will have to be recreated. They cannot be upgraded or migrated. Add workflow to roles and resources. This is now something that you can do from the identity applications user interface. So they're trying to make it easier for you to add a workflow to those roles and resources while you're inside the application without having to jump back into Designer to do that. Ease of usability, nice easy wizard to create that workflow. Do not have the pictures that I saw out there on how you do that, but it's a lot nicer than it used to be, bouncing back and forth between Designer and the user applications, or the identity applications, I should say. One other thing they did is they removed the workflow engine from the identity applications into its own service. So while it could still be installed on the same server, it's actually split out from the core. If everybody remembers the user app, everything used to be in the user app, but they have componentized most of the things in the user app. The user app is kind of still there for API type access, but now they've removed the workflow engine. And one of the reasons they're doing that is the roadmap has this merging of Identity Manager and their access governance product. And we will be seeing these, like the workflow engine will be common between the two applications. So that's why they're doing that. And as they start to, as we start to see how the roadmap's going to show up in 2020, we're going to see all of these products basically become one, and you're going to be able to install the ones that you need. So don't be afraid, the Identity Manager engine is not going away. It's just part of the provisioning portfolio and the other one. So if you're not going to go full-blown IGA, you'll still be able to run Identity Manager. But there'll be common components between the two products, and as you still buy your licensing and things like that, those are the services that you're going to be able to load and execute and license. Okay, let's talk a little bit about managing the state of in progress workflows. So right now, when you're doing an upgrade and things like that, you might worry about the workflows that are in progress losing their state. But there is a way to pause them, even if you're migrating from one database to the other. There is a way to actually import and export as part of that, managing that state of the in progress workflows so that you don't lose those during an upgrade as well. So let's talk a little bit about some options for upgrading. You know, as I was writing this, I began to start to think about the roadmap and how it's coming up. And Identity Manager has been around for a long time, and we're starting to see the market change a little bit, and people are starting to take a look at their cloud strategy. So my first thought here is, this is a good time to actually review. Do you really want this on premise, or most of your applications that you're talking to in the cloud? Does it make sense to have that managed and hosted in our cloud. We've got a good dozen customers or so that we're actually using. That we're actually managing and hosting that either in our cloud. We still have one customer left in Azure, but that's something you need to take a look at. The hybrid mode, you're going to see in the roadmap that a lot of things are going to be in hybrid mode. They're making a nice remote loader so that we can have some things in the cloud, some things that we can have. I'm calling it a remote loader, but it's really a service that's going to tie the on-premise to the things that are in the cloud. And it's a good gateway, I guess you could call it, between the two, so that all the products can talk. Whether, if you want to keep the data locally, but you want to keep the engine and the services up in the cloud, that's something that you can do. But we also need to take a look at, we're going to use public cloud like Azure, AWS. If you have, single sign-on stuff that you're using and it's mostly online applications, we've got Access Manager that can be hosted out there. There's obviously Office 365. Even Google has their own identity providers and things like that out there. So it's time to take a look at that strategy, I think, before you spend the money and the time to do the upgrade in here and just really reflect on your cloud strategy. You should only consider in-place upgrades, obviously, if the OS is supported. Now, we still think our best method is still to migrate to a new server. So we'll bring up, let's say, a SLES 15 SP1 box. We'll install eDirectory on it and insert it inside the vault. Let the replicas sync over there, get that all taken care of, and then we will move the engine over, install Identity Manager, and then move the engine over to the new box. That always gives us the most flexibility in disaster recovery or moving back to the older version. Now, that's mostly for the engine, mostly for the drivers. When we're talking about the advanced edition and the workflows and the databases, you need to consider that, the workflows, the forms, and the databases. That's always kind of the exception. The engine's always pretty easy to do that with. And also, do not forget to review the driver updates and their individual updates. We did not go through that in this webinar of those type of things, but we recommend that you really do read the driver updates, especially like the Google driver that we have. That driver is on there. There are some gotchas with that driver about setting your scopes and your access for the new features that we have or the new APIs that we're using in there. So each driver does have its own README file. You need to take a look at the drivers you're using and take a look at those README files. Okay, that's all I have. So if anybody wants to ask any questions, the Q&A portion is up. I'll be happy to answer those. I'll stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes for that. And if you do